Children of the Almighty God, have you ever felt trapped in a web of confusion, where conversations twist your words and your reality is questioned? Sometimes, those closest to us can distort truth and manipulate love, all while maintaining a mask of virtue. When this happens, you may find yourself in the presence of a narcissist. These interactions are not just difficult, they are designed to make you doubt your own mind. Narcissists have many faces: the arrogant, the victimized, the morally superior. They thrive on control and feed on the emotional chaos they create. C.S. Lewis insightfully wrote, "Pride is spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love or contentment or even common sense." Recognizing these patterns can protect us from the damage they inflict. How often have you questioned your own sanity, your worth, or even your faith because of someone else's manipulative behavior? The Bible tells us in 2 Timothy 3:2-5 that in the last days people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, having a form of godliness but denying its power. This description rings true when we consider the narcissistic traps set for us. But God, in His mercy, equips us with discernment, boundaries, and courage to walk away from such deception. Have you ever found yourself tangled in a relationship where the person you care for seems to shift like shadows under the sun, sometimes towering with grandiosity, other times shrinking into bitterness? Such experiences can confuse and wound the soul, leaving us questioning our worth and even our sanity. These behaviors, while bewildering, often point to something deeper and more dangerous: narcissism. Grandiose narcissism, with its air of self-importance and insatiable hunger for admiration, operates like a towering monument of pride. Such individuals demand the world to orbit around their desires and successes. Yet, the moment that world shudders or falls apart, their confidence crumbles. Have you ever been on the receiving end of their cold disdain, or felt the sharp edge of their need for control? In contrast, vulnerable narcissism simmers quietly with resentment, drawing people in with narratives of victimhood. Here lies the person who believes the universe owes them happiness and validation. They tug at your empathy, making you doubt your boundaries, drawing you into their web of perpetual dissatisfaction. How often do we find ourselves shouldering their burdens, while our own needs are invalidated? We are reminded in 1 Corinthians 13:4, "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud." True love doesn't seek to dominate or manipulate. It does not twist affection into a tool for control or validation. But in relationships poisoned by narcissism, love becomes a battlefield of manipulation, where your genuine care is met with gaslighting, guilt, and shame. And yet, these traits can intertwine. A grandiose narcissist, when defeated, can morph into vulnerability, wearing the mask of victimhood. Conversely, a vulnerable narcissist, given success or praise, can swiftly rise to a pedestal of arrogance. Isn't it striking how deception can shift its form, making us question what is real? We find ourselves caught in cycles of emotional turmoil, questioning our worth, our perception, even our sanity. But there is hope. God's truth anchors us. Psalm 147:3 assures us, "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." Our God is not a God of confusion, but of peace and clarity. He calls us to recognize these patterns not with despair, but with discernment. Perhaps in seeing these shifting behaviors clearly, we begin to see where we need to establish boundaries and seek His wisdom to step away from toxic control. As we explore further, we'll consider how these traits can intertwine dangerously, and how this confusion can lead to deeper manipulation and harm. Have you ever noticed how quickly one mask falls, only for another to take its place. In our journey through life, dear friends in faith, we often encounter people whose nature seems inconsistent. One moment, they stand confident, exuding an air of self-importance. The next, they shrink into a pit of bitterness and self-pity. How can the same person wear both masks? This interchangeability between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism can be one of the most confusing and exhausting experiences in relationships. It's like trying to hold onto shifting sand. The harder you grip, the faster it slips through your fingers. When things go their way, grandiose narcissists appear invincible, their confidence almost blinding. They bask in praise and use it to fuel their self-image. But let life deny them their desires, and you may suddenly find yourself confronted with someone fragile, resentful, and convinced the world is against them. Their grandiosity collapses, and they demand your empathy, making you feel guilty for their failures. Have you ever felt trapped in this emotional whiplash? On the other hand, vulnerable narcissists, who thrive on being perceived as wronged and unappreciated, can rise into grandiosity when circumstances favor them. Given success or admiration, their humility evaporates, replaced by a need to dominate and control. It is as though their sense of self is built on a fragile scaffolding, always ready to collapse or transform, depending on the winds of fortune. Have you ever questioned how the same person can so quickly shift between neediness and dominance? C.S. Lewis once warned of the dangers of self-deception and pride, noting that a proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. In these relationships, the constant oscillation between grandiosity and vulnerability keeps you looking down, focused on their needs, their emotions, and their validation. This subtle manipulation can blind you to the reality of the relationship, and worse, to the truth of your own worth in God's eyes. The emotional confusion they create can lead to feelings of self-doubt, trauma, and guilt. You may find yourself dissociating from your own needs, tethered to their ever-changing demands. Their behavior can invalidate your reality, making you question your own judgment. But remember, God is not the author of confusion. James 1:17 says, "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." In him we find stability and unwavering truth. Perhaps it is in recognizing this interchangeability that we begin to reclaim our peace. When we see the shifting nature of these behaviors, we are called not to engage, defend, or explain, but to stand firm in God's unchanging love and truth. But what happens when this shifting nature takes a darker turn, when control, vindictiveness, and cruelty enter the picture? There are times when we encounter a darkness in human relationships that is profoundly unsettling. Have you ever sensed that beneath someone's charming exterior lurks a cold, calculating intent? This is the shadowed realm of malignant narcissism, a form so dangerous it can strip away your peace, your sense of self, and even your safety. These individuals do not simply crave admiration, they desire control, and their hearts are marked by callousness that disregards the well-being of others. C.S. Lewis insightfully observed in the Screwtape Letters how evil delights in distortion, isolation, and destruction. Malignant narcissists follow a similar pattern. They use manipulation, gaslighting, and guilt to isolate their victims. They track your movements, sometimes literally, and subtly erode your confidence until you begin to question your reality. Have you ever felt the chill of being watched or controlled, even when no words are spoken? The weight of such oppression can be suffocating. This type of narcissist does not merely seek validation, they seek to dominate. They wield blame like a weapon, often making you feel responsible for their rage or vindictive actions. Your trauma, your fear, even your shame becomes their fuel. Their behavior can escalate into verbal, emotional, or physical violence. And yet, despite the pain, many of us remain trapped, held by fear, guilt, or a distorted sense of loyalty. How often do we internalize the blame, believing we are at fault for the chaos they create? In Proverbs 4:23, we are told, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Guarding our hearts means recognizing when someone's intent is not to build us up, but to break us down. Malignant narcissists thrive on your insecurity, your desire for peace, and your hope for reconciliation. But there are times when the most faithful response is to walk away, to set boundaries, and to seek God's protection rather than appease the unappeasable. This is not an easy path. It may feel as though leaving or setting limits betrays your Christian call to love. But love is not complicity with evil. As Romans 12:9 reminds us, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. There is no love in allowing yourself to be destroyed. There is no godliness in tolerating abuse. True love, God's love, calls us to truth, to safety, and to the courage of self-preservation. How then do we respond when faced with this darkness? Perhaps the answer lies in knowing when to step back, when to seek refuge in God's unwavering love, and when to trust that He does not desire us to remain in the shadows of manipulation. But what if this control wears a more subtle disguise, appearing generous or humanitarian, yet driven by self-serving motives? Have you ever been drawn to someone who seemed so selfless, so committed to helping others, that you felt inspired by their generosity? And yet, over time, you began to notice an undercurrent of anger or judgment when their efforts were not met with admiration. This is the realm of communal narcissism, a form of self-focus wrapped in the cloak of altruism. It's a subtle deception, where the desire to serve others is driven not by genuine love, but by a need for external validation. These individuals appear as beacons of goodwill, always ready to serve, always promoting a cause. But behind their works lies a hunger for praise, a desire to be seen as righteous and generous. Have you ever felt the sting of their judgment when you failed to applaud their efforts? Their kindness, once warm, turns cold. Their encouragement shifts to criticism. They are willing to help, so long as their sacrifice is noticed, celebrated, and affirmed. C.S. Lewis once wrote in Mere Christianity, "Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man." Communal narcissists take no joy in the act of giving, unless their giving is elevated, admired, and declared superior. If their acts of service go unnoticed, their disappointment quickly curdles into resentment. Family members, friends, or colleagues often bear the brunt of this anger. Have you ever felt the crushing weight of their expectations, the sense that your role is merely to affirm their virtue? This behavior can chip away at your sense of security, making you feel as though your worth depends on validating their self-image. You may begin to doubt your own generosity or feel guilt for not meeting their impossible standards. Yet, Galatians 1:10 reminds us, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ." Our call is to serve God sincerely, not to become entangled in another's need for recognition. Communal narcissists manipulate through a form of gaslighting that invalidates your feelings. When you express concern or discomfort, they may accuse you of being ungrateful or unkind. Your attempts to set boundaries may be met with accusations designed to evoke guilt and shame. Have you ever felt as though standing up for yourself meant betraying a supposed good person? This confusion traps you, making it hard to see their need for control beneath the surface of their apparent selflessness. But God's truth frees us from these snares. In His eyes, authentic service flows from love, not the desire for applause. True generosity requires no spotlight. How, then, can we protect our hearts from this subtle manipulation? Perhaps it begins with discerning the difference between genuine kindness and kindness laced with control. And what if this desire for validation shifts into a more rigid form, one rooted in moral superiority and relentless judgment? Have you ever encountered someone who clings to rigid standards, convinced of their own moral superiority? This is the domain of self-righteous narcissism. These individuals present themselves as paragons of virtue, yet their righteousness comes with sharp edges. They judge those who fail to meet their expectations, wielding shame and guilt like hammers to mold others into their ideal. Their moral code is not a path to humility, but a pedestal from which they look down on the world. This type of narcissist thrives on the belief that their way is the only way. They measure others not by grace, but by a strict yardstick of behavior, one that often changes to suit their needs. Have you ever felt the sting of being labeled unworthy or sinful simply for making a mistake or choosing a different path? Their rigid standards can leave you feeling small, unsure of your own goodness, as if your worth were constantly on trial. C.S. Lewis wrote in The Problem of Pain, "A man is never so proud as when striking an attitude of humility." Self-righteous narcissists often adopt a posture of humility while condemning those who fail to align with their ideals. They may appear to offer correction in love, but their words carry a hidden barb of superiority. Their aim is not to uplift, but to control. How many times have you questioned your own faith or morals under the weight of their judgment? Such relationships can erode your self-image, making you feel as though your worth depends on their approval. You may begin to internalize blame, believing that you are never good enough. The constant need for validation can leave you spiritually drained, disconnected from the freedom Christ offers. But remember the words of Romans 8:1. Therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. God does not bind us with the chains of perfectionism. He offers us grace and freedom. Self-righteous narcissists manipulate through guilt and shame, making you feel as though setting boundaries is an act of rebellion. They may label your self-care as selfishness, or your need for space as disobedience. But God calls us to wisdom, not blind submission. Jesus himself set boundaries, retreating to pray, choosing whom to trust, and standing firm against those who misuse the law for their own gain. Are we not also called to protect the sanctuary of our souls? Recognizing this form of narcissism can be painful, especially when it comes from those we respect. Yet in this recognition lies the first step toward freedom. What happens then when these dynamics affect not just you, but the innocent hearts of children growing up in such environments? In the quiet corners of a home where narcissism thrives, children often carry unseen burdens. Have you ever wondered what seeds are planted in the hearts of little ones who grow up under the weight of a parent's relentless need for control, validation, or superiority? A child raised by a narcissistic parent often lives in a world devoid of psychological safety. They learn early that their worth is tied to how well they meet the shifting demands of someone else's ego. These children are taught to walk on emotional tightropes, constantly adjusting their behavior to avoid blame or punishment. They internalize guilt for things beyond their control and develop a chronic sense of shame. Their developing minds are shaped by gaslighting, invalidating comments, and subtle or overt manipulation. Have you ever met someone who, even as an adult, still hears that critical voice telling them they are not enough? This is the echo of childhood trauma. As C.S. Lewis observed in The Four Loves, affection can be a cloak for many sins. A narcissistic parent may claim to love, but their love demands compliance and feeds on the child's need for approval. Instead of fostering self-confidence and emotional security, these parents sow insecurity, teaching children to question their perceptions, dismiss their own needs, and seek external validation. Imagine the confusion in a child's heart when love and approval are given only when they serve the parent's desires. Over time, these children become experts in dissociation, disconnecting from their true selves to survive. They may grow into adults who struggle with self-blame, always assuming they are at fault when relationships go wrong. They may fall into toxic patterns, drawn to those who mirror the familiar dynamics of control and invalidating behavior. How many times do we see these wounded souls trapped in abusive relationships, unaware that the roots of their pain reach back to childhood? But God sees these children. In Psalm 27:10, we are reminded, "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." There is healing in his love, a restoration that breaks the chains of inherited trauma. He calls us to nurture, protect, and defend the vulnerable hearts in our care. When we recognize the patterns of narcissistic harm, we are also called to intervene, to be a voice of compassion and truth in the lives of those who cannot yet speak for themselves. Perhaps the greatest challenge lies in understanding how narcissists set these traps of manipulation so effectively. How do they create such confusion that even adults doubt their own reality? Traps set by narcissists are rarely obvious. They are subtle, like a web spun in silence, waiting for the unsuspecting to stumble into it. Have you ever found yourself questioning your own memory, judgment, or sanity after a conversation? This is no accident. Narcissists often employ gaslighting, a tactic designed to distort your perception of reality. Their aim is to confuse you so deeply that you rely on them for the truth, even when that truth is a lie crafted for their benefit. Perhaps you've noticed how they use mockery disguised as humor. A casual, cutting remark is passed off as a joke, and when you express hurt, you're told, "You're too sensitive." This invalidation chips away at your confidence, making you wonder if your feelings are the real problem. Have you felt trapped in this cycle, afraid to speak up for fear of being belittled or dismissed? Their manipulation makes you doubt yourself while keeping their control intact. Narcissists are skilled at blame shifting. When confronted, they redirect the blame onto you, making you feel guilty for their wrongs. You might hear phrases like, "If you hadn't done that, I wouldn't have reacted this way." Slowly, the guilt becomes internalized, and you find yourself apologizing for things that were never your fault. How often have you borne the weight of someone else's wrongdoing, convinced that you are the one who needs to change? C.S. Lewis warns us in the screw-tape letters of the enemy's tactic to create confusion and self-doubt. The more often he feels without acting, the less he will be able ever to act, and in the long run, the less he will be able to feel. This emotional numbness can result from prolonged exposure to narcissistic manipulation. You may find yourself trapped in dissociation, unable to act or even recognize your own needs. The best defense against these traps is not to engage. Do not explain, defend, or try to convince a narcissist of your perspective. Such efforts only deepen the snare. Instead, practice self-defense through boundaries. When faced with manipulation, a simple response like, "I'm not going to discuss this," can protect your peace. Remember the wisdom of Proverbs 4:14-15. Do not set foot on the path of the wicked. Avoid it. Do not travel on it. Turn from it and go on your way. Recognizing these traps can be painful, but it is the first step toward freedom. Yet, once you see them, how do you cope with the ongoing presence of a narcissist in your life? Is there a way to navigate these relationships without losing yourself? In relationships with narcissists, the emotional terrain is fraught with pitfalls, and survival often hinges on how well you navigate it. Have you ever found that any attempt to connect on a deeper level only invites conflict or manipulation? With these individuals, emotional intimacy is a battlefield, not a refuge. To protect your heart and mind, sometimes the wisest approach is to keep interactions superficial. Engaging in small talk or neutral subjects like the weather, news, or shared activities can minimize opportunities for conflict. Deep discussions about feelings, needs, or expectations can be twisted and used against you. By keeping things light and surface level, you shield yourself from the traps of gaslighting and blame shifting. This isn't giving up, it's self-defense. It is recognizing that some relationships are better managed with distance rather than depth. Radical acceptance is another tool that offers protection. Accepting that a narcissist is unlikely to change frees you from the exhausting cycle of trying to fix or heal them. This acceptance doesn't mean condoning their behavior. It means releasing the expectation that they will suddenly become who you need them to be. Have you ever felt the weight lift when you finally acknowledged that some hearts are closed to transformation? In this acceptance lies your freedom. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of self-respect. Jesus himself modeled this. In Matthew 10:14, he instructed his disciples, "If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet." Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for them is to walk away, or at least step back. Maintaining emotional and physical distance can protect you from the constant pressure to appease, defend, or explain. It's also important to recognize when to seek support. Being in a relationship with a narcissist can lead to trauma, self-doubt, and shame. Confiding in trusted friends, a pastor, or a counselor can provide the validation and emotional security you need. There is no shame in asking for help. Even Moses needed Aaron and Hur to hold up his arms when he grew weary. Exodus 17:12. You were never meant to bear this alone. Protecting yourself from a narcissist does not mean you lack love or faith. It means you are practicing wisdom. God does not ask us to remain in toxic relationships that diminish his image in us. As you walk this path, remember that your worth is anchored not in the approval of others, but in the unchanging love of God. And in this love, we find the strength to reclaim our peace. Narcissistic traps are designed to pull you away from your own sense of reality, to blur your understanding of truth and love. But as you've journeyed through these reflections, you've gained the tools to see clearly. Remember, your worth is not tied to someone else's approval, nor is your faith measured by how much you endure in a toxic relationship. God calls you to freedom, clarity, and peace. As you move forward, ask yourself, what boundaries do I need to set to honor the life God has given me? How can I reclaim my sense of self, knowing I am fearfully and wonderfully made? Psalm 139:14. Let this truth be your shield against manipulation, your guide in the fog of confusion. If this message has touched your heart, take a moment to affirm your faith by commenting, "Angels walk with me. I am shielded by grace." Share this wisdom with others who need it, and remember to like and subscribe, so we can continue this journey of faith and truth together.